Okay, our third best paper candidate, unfortunately, they are not able to come, but they are going to present online, and Matthew will help us to transition to Zoom. All right, thanks, Matthew. And then let's welcome Professor Martin Henze. He's doing industrial security research at Aachen University in Germany and Fraunhofer. And he's going to talk about bidirectional TLS handshake caching for constrained industrial IoT scenarios. So let's welcome Martin.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. So for me, it's the middle of the night. For you, good morning. I hope you enjoy the conference in Sydney. With this presentation, I would like to convey to you why TLS handshake caching is very important to secure industrial Internet of Things, and especially, of course, how our approach can help to realize strong security in this critical scenario. Unfortunately, none of us could come to the conference. However, if you would like to get more information, two of my colleagues are on site. So in case you want to dig deeper in what we're doing in general, you want to explore potential for cooperation, please talk to Stefan and Jan. They will be around for the complete conference and happy to answer any questions that you also have beyond the Q&A. Okay, but to get us started, so what is the industrial Internet of Things and why do we need to care about end-to-end security here? And especially, of course, why do we need to care for resource constraints? So the term industrial Internet of Things essentially is a very broad topic, but it refers to the increasing trend of using internet technology in industrial scenarios. So essentially, think about industrial devices communicating over IP-based networks, and thus potentially also communicating over untrusted network, potentially the internet. So we need to do something because the communication paths might not be trusted. And yeah, the obvious choice to secure communication over an untrusted communication path is end-to-end security, because that gives us protection against any on-path attacker that would eavesdrop on the communication, try to impersonate one of the communication partners, or try to modify whatever we are communicating. However, things are not that easy because industrial networks are resource constrained, and oftentimes resource constraints here means we have a limited amount of bandwidth. So, but why is that problematic if we want to use end-to-end security? So to better understand that, let us have a brief look at TLS, or transport layer security, which is a key candidate for realizing end-to-end security in industrial IoT networks. So in a nutshell, TLS consists of two parts. We have an initial handshake that is used to establish a secure connection. And then subsequently, once we have established a secure connection, we have secure transmission of application data. So the latter is rather resource efficient, so that's not for our concern, but let's have a closer look at the handshake to better understand why it's challenging to operate TLS in a constrained environment. So in essence, the TLS handshake on a very high level has two parts. The first one is to negotiate parameters such as which cipher suits we're going to use and to exchange whatever key material we need. The second part then is about mutual authentication, meaning we want to verify the identity of the other communication party so that we know that whoever we are talking to is actually who we believe it is. So such a handshake results in a communication overhead of multiple kilobytes. I mean, the details change a bit depending on which ciphers you're using, but it's fair to say it's certainly going to be a multiple of kilobytes. And this quickly becomes infeasible if you have tightly resource-constrained IoT networks. And if you look a bit closer, one of the major contributors to that communication overhead are the certificates that are required to establish trust into the identity of our communication partners. So the question then is, I mean, given these constraints, how can we still deploy TLS in such a constrained IoT network? And of course, we are not the first ones to look into that field. There's a lot of research on optimizing the bandwidth consumption of TLS. And we can coarsely classify those into 3 categories. And the first one is about what we call profiles and optimized encoding. So here the idea is essentially you try to optimize the representation of the protocol. You might leave out certain features. You might format things differently. So the good thing about that is it does not really impact the security guarantees that we have, but the improvements that you can get are only so much. So it's rather minor improvements that you get, and oftentimes the improvements that you get come at the cost of interoperability because you're changing how the protocol looks like. Still, like, this is a relevant field of research, and especially whatever improvements you can make here can come on top of the improvements that you do in the other categories. In contrast to that, we have this whole field of out-of-band transmissions. So essentially the idea is we somehow improve the overhead by assuming we have an additional communication channel that is out of band, typically that's unconstrained, that we can, for example, use to exchange certificates. And so of course it's nice because if we assume that we can have such a channel, then we can have a lot of decent bandwidth savings on paper. But the issues that you have here is typically with regards to scalability and trust issues, because I mean, if you have that other channel, you need to somehow link the two securely together. And oftentimes it's also unrealistic to assume that you have that additional communication channel, because if you have that, why not use that for communication in the first place? So the final category of related work is this whole field of caching. So that idea is to identify static parts in the connection establishment that we keeps on repeating for subsequent connections, and then try to do savings based on getting rid of those static parts. And this is the main focus of our work. And the core idea here is essentially you do an initial handshake, then you know what's going to be static information, you store that, and then you don't have to retransmit it. So that's a nice idea because then the subsequent handshakes become shorter, and you obviously save a lot of communication overhead. There's a very drastic approach to that, which is called session caching or session resumption. So essentially the idea is you cache the complete TLS session that you have established, meaning then if you do a subsequent handshake, you essentially can directly continue where you left off. So this is very resource efficient, but it has the downside that you don't do any re-authentication. You have to reuse keying material, and also you bind several connection attempts cryptographically to each other. So if one gets compromised, all of them might get compromised. And this means, because this weakens security, that typically the lifetime of such a session has to be reduced. In contrast, handshake caching constitutes an alternative which allows to more granularly define on what we're going to cache. So it's going to be part of the handshake, so actually parts of the protocol. And then if you do an abbreviated handshake, only a part of the cached message is omitted. So this is what we're going to focus on. And there has been a lot of work in this direction. So over the years, various approaches have been proposed. And in the end, this accumulated in the standardization of RFC 7924, the so-called cached information extension. And in a nutshell, the client would cache the server certificate and the certificate request message during an initial handshake. And then in subsequent handshakes, we can omit those. So in general, this is a promising approach, but if you think about deploying that for constrained industrial IoT scenarios, there are various considerations that we have to make. And the first one is, this is just a specification of a protocol. This specification does not tell us how to actually cache certificates. Then there is no compatibility with TLS 1.3, which is increasingly becoming relevant for IoT scenarios. And it only covers server-to-client messages. That means there is no caching on the server side, which also means if you use client authentication, and thus client certificates, as it is prevalent in the IIoT, there's no option to cache those. So the questions that we strive to address with our research is, can we still leverage this protocol, or how can we still leverage this protocol to reduce bandwidth in the IIoT? And especially, how can we account for the prevalent use of client authentication? So to answer these questions, let me briefly sketch the general idea of our approach. And first, we look again at an abstract sketch of a TLS handshake in which the client initiates a connection, then the server responds with a typically fairly large message, which includes its certificate. Then the client goes ahead and verifies that certificate, which is a resource-intensive computation, especially for an embedded IoT device. And once it's verified everything's fine, it will respond with another message that is fairly large, containing the certificate of the client. Then the server essentially does the same, also verifies the certificates, and then concludes the handshake. So our approach now to reduce bandwidth and computational overhead of this handshake conceptually works as follows. So we first do this initial handshake, just as seen. Then both client and server cache the static certificates contained in the handshake message. And if you then do a subsequent handshake, we can use these cached certificates to substantially abbreviate the handshake. So how would that look like? So the client would send a slightly larger first initial message, signaling that it has cached some relevant content, upon which then the server knows, okay, there's a cached certificate we can use. So instead of sending the actual certificate, the server would just send a small placeholder for the certificate to use. The client then looks up the actual information in its cache and potentially also then speeds up the processing so that in the end, we don't have to transmit the certificate. We also don't have to recompute all the information and verify the certificate. And rather quickly then can figure out, okay, everything's fine, we can continue with the connection establishment. Then the other direction works exactly the same. So the client sends just a placeholder instead of the actual certificate. The server can then look up the certificate in the cache, also speed up the computation, and finalize the handshake. And this gives us two advantages. So the first one is we save on bandwidth because we don't have to retransmit all these certificates again. But also, as you've probably already guessed, we save on processing, which is not only nice because it saves resources, but it also means that the handshake commences quicker. So the latency for actually being able to transmit data is reduced. To realize this savings, our approach relies on three core components. And in the following, we will look at some selected details for each of the components. So first, we will look at caching of static server information, then our flip side to that for static client information, and then how we can minimize processing using cached static information. So first looking at caching the server-side information. As I already said, a lot of work has been done in that direction, but what is left open is how to actually store and access cached objects. And in order to figure out what we actually need, it makes sense to look at when would you actually need access to cached certificates. And there are two different reasons on why you would need access to cached certificates. The first one, I guess, is the obvious one. This is what we call the primary lookup is the client or the server receives a message with an omitted certificate. So there's just a placeholder instead of the actual certificate. And now we need to use that placeholder, which we call a fingerprint, to look up that certificate. So this is the easy case. The other case is needed for announcing which certificates to use. So the client established a connection with the server and then needs to tell the server which certificates it has stored. And the intuitive way would be for the client to simply send all cached fingerprints that it has, but for one that would create overhead, and on the other hand that it would induce privacy risk because unknowns everything that you've cached, so that could be used for tracking. So what we do instead is we leverage the server name indication or the host name to make things more easy as an identifier to identify relevant entries. So we will just look up which certificates we have stored for that host name and will only submit fingerprints for those. So now for our novel caching scheme to also cache client certificates, the main challenge that we have here is that the server has no way of identifying the client on connection setup. So the client typically has no static host name, the client typically has no static IP, and so typically in TLS the assumption is the server only learns about the identity of the client when receiving the client certificate. But if you want to cache the client certificate, it's too late because, I mean, we don't want to transmit the client certificate. So the idea that we came up with to alleviate that situation is to create tickets to identify cached client certificate. So the client would then present that certificate to identify certificates. So how that would work is, based on the initial handshake, both client and server would generate such a ticket, and this happens implicitly, so both will end up with the same ticket. And then the client just presents a list of cached tickets. Again, those are scoped to the host name of the server, and then the server can identify which certificate to use. This, of course, means we need another second small client cache to keep track on the tickets on the client side. And then finally, to minimize processing overhead, beyond just minimizing bandwidth overhead, and then also latency, we have the idea of skipping the revalidation of the signatures in the certificate chain. And this, of course, might seem a bit counterintuitive, so why would you skip a security operation? But essentially, the observation is the following. If the certificate does not change, and I mean, we cache it because we assume it's not going to change, also the validation of that signature will not change. I mean, you just do the same computation on the same input, you will have the same output. And this means we can omit large parts of the certificate chain from recurring processing. And also, we don't even have to cache these large parts because we're never going to look at that again. So once we've initially verified the certificate chain, there's only very little that we actually need to cache. So obviously, we need to have the public key because we need to be able to still verify signatures over the handshake. And then we need very little information. So what we need is the validity dates of the certificate so that we can check each time whether the certificate has expired or not. And then we optionally could have information to check for key revocation, such as CRL or OCSP. And if you use this functionality, also that information, of course, needs to be stored. But everything else then isn't needed. So to be able to fully quantify what actually the advantages of our approach are, but also to make it available for practical deployment, we created a full proof of concept implementation on top of the TLS library wolfSSL, which is the first implementation of RFC 7924 in a common library, plus all our contributions of that paper, and support for TLS 1.2 and 1.3. And for everyone who wants to use that, that's freely available on GitHub on that link. And using that implementation, we can now assess both the savings that our approach gives, but also the cost that it has in terms of memory overhead. And we do that both in a Dockerized virtual environment and on resource-constrained actual hardware. Yeah, and then we will look at the bandwidth improvements that our approach gives, the processing improvements that we can use to additionally reduce handshake latency, and finally the cost in terms of memory overhead. So let us get started with the bandwidth improvements. So what is the effectiveness in our approach in reducing the bandwidth overhead? And we first look at TLS 1.2. We do these measurements in a virtualized environment, and we look at 3 scenarios. So a very resource-constrained IEEE 802.15.4 network with an MTU of 127 bytes, then a scenario with the minimum supported MTU for IPv4, and then the typical MTU for Ethernet of 1,500 bytes. And we do that for chains of 3 RSA 248-bit certificates. So first we look at a vanilla TLS implementation, so no optimization at all. And if you then do just what is already out there, so the RFC 7924, you see that you get a reduction of about 30% in bandwidth usage. With our bidirectional approach, you can essentially double the savings to 60%. And then you can get even better than that if you do session resumption. So then you can get savings of up to 75%. But here you have to account for that you get weaker security. So what we can take away here is, for one, we reduce bandwidth usage by about 60%. And those savings are especially pronounced for tightly bandwidth constrained networks. So the question then, of course, is how do these savings carry over to TLS 1.3? So we use the same setup to answer that. We just look at Ethernet with an MTU of 1500 bytes, and again, a chain of 3 RSA 248-bit certificates. What you see here is, both in the unmodified case and in the existing caching approach, essentially it doesn't matter. So you get roughly the same bandwidth usage. Versus for our approach, you see it's similar but slightly higher because signaling works slightly different in TLS 1.3. Perhaps surprisingly, for session resumption, you now see that it has fewer savings for TLS 1.3, as mainly due to their switch to session tickets to account for perfect forward secrecy. But still, even after that, it provides weaker security than other caching approaches. So what we see is, with the ongoing shift towards TLS 1.3 in IIoT scenarios, the added security that our approach has over session resumption becomes even more attractive because the delta that you have for using the less secure approach becomes smaller. So looking at processing improvements, the question is, what is the additional benefit beyond bandwidth savings if we can now skip the redundant computation of certificate verification? So we do those measurements on a Raspberry Pi Zero, and we vary the certificate chain lengths both for RSA and ECC certificates. What you see here for RSA certificates and varying certificate lengths is that we can save about 15 to 20 milliseconds for RSA certificates. And if we do the same for ECC certificates, you see it's about 20 to 30 milliseconds that we can save, and this is a lot in an industrial IoT setting. And as such, it's not only bandwidth savings that we have, but also a speed up on the handshake by tens of milliseconds. So finally, looking at the memory overhead and essentially the question of, now what is the cost of doing that? Because obviously we're caching information, we need memory for that. So again, we are measuring in a virtualized environment and we profile the peak memory usage. So this is the baseline that you have if you do no caching at all. So both for RSA and ECC certificates, you need about 50 kilobit of memory. If you now cache certificates, I guess as expected, this leads to an overhead that scales linearly with the number of cached certificates. What you need to keep in mind that we're not going to communicate with dozens of other IoT devices. So realistically, we're going to be somewhere in that region. So it's going to be perhaps 5, 10, 20 certificates that we will have cached. And if you see that, then the overhead is well manageable, because now we are talking about an overhead of about 10 kilobytes. That is something I would argue is well worth the additional functionality and savings that we give. So let me briefly, or very briefly, talk about the security and privacy considerations of our approach. And the main question, of course, is, does that weaken security if we now start caching certificates? And the short answer is no, because we don't change the semantics of the handshakes. And whatever we omit from the handshake is still cryptographically linked to the handshake. And this gives us clear advantages over session resumption as the main comparison, because we don't reuse submitter keys. We have longer lifetimes possible. But also, I guess it's a nice result. You can actually combine those short savings that session resumption gives and the long-term savings that the handshake caching gives you. Then the other obvious question is, is there an increased risk for device tracking? Because, I mean, now we are sending fingerprints of things that we have cached, so that could be used for tracking. But the information that we actually send does not go beyond what you would reveal if you provide client certificates. And this is mainly due to us scoping everything based to the host name, so that rules out any tracking. And also, if you consider TLS 1.2, our server-side caching even improves client privacy, because now we are not going to reveal the client certificate all the time, but rather a changing fingerprint. So to summarize this presentation, so we address this challenge that we have in IIoT scenarios. We want or we have to use end-to-end security, but also we have bandwidth constraints. And our solution to that challenge is a comprehensive bidirectional handshake caching, where we cache both information concerning the server certificate, but also the client certificate. And we do so not only to save bandwidth, but also to minimize the processing overhead. And this gives us quite substantial bandwidth and processing savings at very reasonable memory overhead. Most importantly, there are no semantic changes to the TLS protocol, so the strong security and privacy guarantees of TLS persist, and we have the substantial security advantages over session resumption. And if you're not convinced yet, I mean, post-quantum cryptography is on the horizon, and this will mean larger public keys, larger signatures, larger certificates, meaning there's more potential for savings and potentially even enabling constraints devices to use post-quantum cryptography at all, only if you do handshake caching. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Martin. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering whether this approach of caching is still the right strategy when we move towards very short-lived certificates. That's the trend. We see Let's Encrypt announcing short-lived certificates and so on. So is it still the right way to go, or should we then also consider other approaches?
I mean, to a certain degree, that of course depends on what short-lived means. But I mean, if you go down to less than a day, then probably it doesn't make sense anymore. And then I guess you need to completely reinvent what you're doing here, because also you need to get the certificates on those devices in the first place quite often. So probably we need something completely else than TLS. But as long as certificates are substantially longer valid than you do handshakes, so I don't know, you do hundreds or thousands of handshakes with one certificate, it still makes sense to do the caching.
Any more questions from audience?
Hi, thank you for your great talk. And I'm curious about security risk. Okay, so often caching something would bring new attack surface like cache poisoning attack or something like that. So is there any opportunity to bring new attack surface or increase security risk by adopting this mechanism? Thank you.
I mean, the issue that you of course have a cache, and you need to trust the cache, right? I mean, if I don't know, I cache, I have received a certain certificate, I verified that, and now I assume for the future that that certificate is valid. And now somehow an attacker manages to change that information or to inject that information in my cache, then you're screwed. And that might sound concerning. I would argue it's not, because if somebody is able to manipulate the cache on your IoT device, given the typical architecture that we have on such a device with like a very flat memory layout, that means that essentially they can also change your application, they can also change all your keying material. So at that point where somebody is able to mess with your cache, they are on your device, and then they could also do all kinds of other harms. So yes, it's a valid concern that somebody could manipulate the cache, but if somebody can do that, you have a lot of other problems as well.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Any more questions? Okay. If not, given the time, we would like to conclude this session. Thanks a lot, Martin, presenting online. Yeah, we can send any messages to Martin if you want. You can join through the Zoom online session. You can also join, and then he will be there. And thanks a lot, everyone. After this, lunch will be downstairs. Okay, we will need to finish lunch, in 1 hour. So we will see how it goes today. And yeah, so that's all for the first session, and we will see you back in 1 hour.